Harlem Renaissance was the name given to the cultural, social, and artistic explosion that took place in Harlem, New York. Beginning at the end of World War I, this period ended in the 1930s at the wake of the Great Depression. The Harlem Renaissance widely promoted African American artistic creativity. African American singers, poets, writers, and musicians became popular during this period. The name the Harlem Renaissance became popular after the time of the movement. The name was first used in the Herald Tribune, a newspaper talking about these new black artists. The purpose was to advance African Americans to full citizenship. This period introduced musicians such as Billie Holiday, activists such as Marcus Garvey, and other jazz singers such as Louis Armstrong and Henry Allen. Billie Holiday was a singer born in April of 1915. She was a very influential jazz singer of the Harlem Renaissance. She sang blues about her own life experience and of how blacks were mistreated during this time. Her most famous song was her rendition of a song named Strange Fruit. She sang about black lynchings, a trend that rapidly grew amongst whites, mainly in the South. This shows how although the Harlem Renaissance main focus was the arts, they also had a unique way of expressing their views of race relations. Another significant figure of the Harlem Renaissance was Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey, many think of him as an activist, and only an activist, but he wrote multiple books and he was credited for the expanding of the Harlem Renaissance. He worked hard at expanding black arts to keep African American children interested in education. His agenda was to gain respect by advancing our own race. Garvey was a very respected intellectual figure out of this time, and he was also an author. Marcus Garvey wrote 32 books in his time. Most of his books dealt with philosophy, and his intended audience were African Americans, especially younger African Americans. He also had a collection of poems which he published. The Harlem Renaissance bred many influential jazz singers who are still famous today. Louis Armstrong was a jazz singer and musician, and he played the trumpet, influenced new jazz artists, and created a more free-flowing type of jazz that had a greater expression of emotion by using improvisation and scatting. Louis Armstrong was born in August of 1901 in New Orleans, but he moved to the North where he could prosper as a musician. He died in 1971. Henry Allen was another jazz trumpeter, and he was highly influenced by Louis Armstrong. He was also born in Louisiana and moved up north during the time of the Harlem Renaissance. He incorporated a lot of Louis' work into his own work, and he was the first to use Louis' improvisation and scatting as a large form of art. He was a part of several bands throughout his career, and he is better known as Red Allen. Henry Allen died in 1967 at the age of 61.
Edward Ellington was born in Washington, D.C., April 29, 1899. He was an American orchestra and band leader of jazz orchestra. He led his orchestra from 1923 until his death, his career spanning over 50 years. He was raised by two talented musician parents in the middle-class neighborhood of Washington, D.C. At the age of 7, he began studying piano and earned his nickname Duke. In the 1920s, Ellington performed in a Broadway nightclubs as the band leader of a sextet group, which in the time grew to a 10-piece ensemble. Ellington's fame rose in the 1940s when he composed several masterworks, including Cottontail, Coco, and some of his most popular songs, including It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got the Swing. Langston Hughes was born February 1st, 1902 in Missouri. He was an American poet, novelist, and playwright whose African American themes made him a primary contributor to the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s. His parents separated soon after his birth. His father moved to Mexico while his mother moved around during his youth. He stayed with his grandmother until she died in his early teens. He published his first poem in 1921 and his first book in 1926. He quickly became part of the Harlem culture movement, which is known as the Harlem Renaissance. His poem, The Word Blues, won first place in the Opportunity magazine. He also published his first novel, Not Without Laughter. On May 22, 1969, Langston Hughes died from complications of prostate cancer.
Cabell Calloway III was born on December 25, 1907, in Rochester, New York. He grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, which is where he first started singing. After a move to Chicago, Illinois, Calloway began to study law at Crane College, but his main focus always remained on his music. While performing at Chicago's Sunset Club, Calloway met Louis Armstrong. Armstrong tutored him in the art of scat singing, which is using nonsensical sounds to improvise melodies. In 1928, Calloway took over the leadership of his own band, the Alabamians. When he felt he was ready to take the next step in his career, he headed to New York. Cab Calloway was a significant figure of the Harlem Renaissance. He became a star because of his many performances at Harlem's famous Cotton Club. He's most known for his hit song in 1931, Minnie the Moocher. Calloway also did some acting during this time, both on stage and in films. He became one of the most popular entertainers of the 1930s and 40s. After an amazing career, Cab Calloway was presented a National Medal of the Arts from President Bill Clinton in 1993. Shortly after, he began to have many major health problems. Calloway passed away the next year on November 18, 1994, at the age of 86. Zora Neale Hurston was born in Alabama on January 7, 1891. Hurston was the daughter of two former slaves, and her father, John Hurston, was a pastor. He moved their family to Florida when Hurston was still very young. After the death of Hurston's mother in 1904 and her father's subsequent remarriage, Hurston lived with many different family members for the next few years. Zora Neale Hurston worked a variety of jobs to support herself and finance her efforts to get an education. She even worked as a maid for an actress. In 1920, Hurston earned an associate degree from Howard University. She published one of her earliest works in the university's newspaper. A few years later, she moved to a Harlem neighborhood where she became a major part of the area's thriving art scene. She also began to work alongside many of the already famous writers at that time. Hurston spent her early adulthood studying at various universities and collecting traditions from the South, the Caribbean, and Latin America. She published her findings in Mules and Men, a book published in 1935. In 1937, Hurston published her most famous piece of work, Their Eyes Were Watching God. Though she had an amazing and influential career, Zora Neale Hurston still suffered from several strokes and passed on January 28, 1960. She died poor and alone and was also buried in an unmarked grave in Fort Pierce, Florida. Aaron Douglas was an African-American painter and graphic artist who played an essential role in the Harlem Renaissance during the 1920s and 30s. He was born on May 26, 1899 in Topeka, Kansas. After graduating from Topeka High School in 1917, Douglas attended the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. In college, he pursued his passion for creating art by earning a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in 1922. After teaching for 2 years at Lincoln High School in Kansas City, Missouri, Douglas moved to New York City. Aaron Douglas was a leading figure in the Harlem Renaissance and is sometimes referred to as the father of Black American art. His unique artistic style was famous for combining his interest in modernism and African art. In 1930, when Douglass was creating his best work, he was hired to create a mural for the library at Fisk University. By 1939, Douglass started teaching at Fisk University, where he remained for the next 27 years. Aaron Douglass died of pulmonary embolism on February 2, 1979, at the age of 79.